Welcome back to another episode of A Gift from Adversity. My name is Juri. I'm your host. Thank you so much for tuning in today. I have a wonderful guest coming in from New Hampshire today. His name is John Tommasi. Before I introduce my guest, I want to introduce my book, which is called A Gift from Adversity. Same title as my podcast, A Gift from Adversity, and it's available on Amazon. The subtitle of this book is Overcoming Sexual Abuse, Domestic Violence, Bullying, and Homelessness. After I published my book, I got a lot of messages from people that I have known or that I have never met, telling their adversity, sharing their stories, sexual abuse, domestic violence, etc. This year, I decided to do the podcast to create a platform where people can talk safely about the adversity, but not only that, tools that they use to overcome, and then a gift came from it. And this is our episode 72, and we've had guests from all over the world, and I'm so grateful that people are willing to share their adversity, their stories, and trying to normalize difficult conversations so we can all overcome these challenges in our lives together. So let's introduce our guest tonight. Hi, John.
Hi, Juri. How you doing?
Good. Thank you so much for tuning in today and then coming to A Gift from Adversity.
Absolutely. I was looking forward to it.
Absolutely. So, John, before we jump into our main question, would you please introduce our guest, who you are, and then what you do, and if you have any website or social media handle that people can follow you?
Okay. My name is John Tommasi. I've been a police officer for 48 years. 24 of those have been full-time, and I'm still a part-time police officer. It's full-time during the summer here at Hampton Beach, New Hampshire. It's a resort town, and part-time for the rest of the year. I also taught college for about 40 years. It was part-time when I was a full-time officer. And then once I retired from the police department, I taught up at Bentley College outside of Boston, and then the University of New Hampshire. Recently retired for that, but again, still working as a police officer. My website is johntommasi.com. It's a combination economics website, and I've written 3 books that are on Amazon, like you, and you could read their prologues and first chapter on that website, johntommasi.com.
And can you tell our audience what are the books that you published a little bit?
Sure. The first book was a book of fiction. I was assigned to the New Hampshire Drug Task Force and the Drug Enforcement Agency for 4 years working undercover drugs. The first book is named Danger Zone. It's loosely based on my time in the Drug Task Force. The second and third books are true crime books. They're nonfiction. The second book is called Murder at the Front Door. It is the true story of the murder of Richard Cushing by an off-duty Hampton police officer who had a 13-year grudge against him. And he carried this grudge for 13 years. The third book was called Murder Outside the Back Door, and these are available on Amazon. And it is the true story of the murder of a Salem, New Hampshire school teacher by her husband in Lawrence, Mass. And that was labeled a Charles Stewart type murder because he blamed the murder on the violence in the city at Lawrence, Mass when he himself did it. It was a particularly gruesome murder.
So, how are the book going and how is it received so far?
The book sales are doing very well. I'm very happy with it. I'm getting a lot of positive feedback from the books. And like I said, I've taught school for quite a while. So this is kind of the 2 things I do best is research and then writing. And I've enjoyed doing it.
And what were you teaching at college?
I was teaching economics and finance, which a lot of people look at me funny and said, "You're a police officer and you're teaching economics and finance." Well, I started off in the business world. I had a master's in business administration. Got tired of the business world and became a cop. Enjoyed being a cop, and I started teaching part time. And then right before I retired, I was thinking of retirement, and I went back to my alma mater, University of New Hampshire, and got another master's degree. This one in economics.
That's very impressive that while you were doing a police job, that you were still able to teach completely different subject. And I was thinking that you were teaching criminal justice.
Everyone does that, but I really enjoy what I'm doing. And Will Rogers said it best: "If you like what you're doing, if you like your job, then you'll never work a day in your life."
Wonderful. So let's dive into our first question, which is the adversity. So, what would you say? What your adversity is? What was your adversity?
The very tough part of being a police officer was seeing the dark side of life. You know, I've been to a lot of murder scenes. I was involved in the cases of both books that I wrote, um, and it's particularly gruesome scenes. One individual was shot with a double-barreled shotgun. The other book, Murder Outside the Back Door, two girls were killed by multiple stab wounds by three boys who wanted to experience how it was to kill someone. It was a particularly um, brutal scene that you just have to go and deal with it.
And prior to our interview, once when you started to become a police officer, one of the first call was about baby.
Yeah, I had just had my first child, and I had to go to a call, and she was very healthy, everything was going great, and I had to go to a call where the parents were just totally broken up. They had their child died after about 6 months, and they knew right from the beginning that this child only had 6 months to live, and this child was very close to my daughter's age. So that was difficult to deal with. That was probably, if I had to pick my most difficult call as a police officer, I would pick that one.
So describe to our audience um, who are absolutely not like no familiar with law enforcement, the demand of your mental health and being a police officer, seeing these brutal murders in the scenes. Like, how would you describe that? Like, we have no idea, but we are the same human being, and you are the front line seeing this ugliest side of a human being.
Police work has really evolved over the past 40 years when I've been a police officer. Um, we've gone from not showing the emotions and just deal with it. The way I dealt with it back in the 80s, 90s, and right after 2000 was you talk to other cops about it. We have something in police work called quiet practice. And what quiet practice is cops getting together after the end of, say, an early night shift, 4 to midnight shift, and having a few beers. And you just talk with your friends about it, and that kind of alleviates the pressure that you're under. Um, we've seen quite a metamorphosis in police work. What has happened, particularly in the past 10 years, is there's been a lot of employee assistance programs, which you saw very frequently in the private sector, but you never saw in police work. But we have that now. Um, in the police departments that I've worked, both Salem, New Hampshire, and Hampton, New Hampshire, we have what's known as wellness squads, and it's police officers who will talk with other police officers who are going through a um, traumatic issue because of a call they've gone on. Usually, it involves a lot of police shootings or just violent deaths. Uh, both the subject contents of the books were violent deaths, um, and just even going to an accident that is a violent death is difficult. I mean, some police officers have retired because of that. Um, Others have killed themselves. There was a police captain in Derry, New Hampshire, who about a couple of years ago killed himself. There was a retired lieutenant from Salem who did the same thing just because the pressures of the job followed him after he retired. Um, but again, these assistance programs and just talking out your problems with other people who understand seem to really help. And you didn't have that 15, 20 years ago, whereas pretty much all police departments have that now.
It's very heartbreaking to know that mental health absolutely talk talk about mental health is getting more normalized, especially after the global pandemic and coming out of everybody getting isolated for over like 2 years and then
Hmm.
any ages. But it's sad that in my case, for instance, in Japan, child sex abuse, domestic violence, those are hash hash. Nobody talked about it. Nobody knew what it was. Nobody knew what PTSD was. This is
Hmm.
back in Japan in 80s. School never had a counselor. Nobody had understanding of the magnitude of emotional injury and then lifelong impact. So when you are dealing with this in 80s, 90s, like you said, like you go maybe get a beer and then like hash hash kind of talk through. How would you describe it compared to now that you have these resources and then places that you can have help? And when you didn't have those help, how was it kind of affecting your normal life?
Um, I was able to deal with it pretty well because I was a bachelor for quite a long time. But looking at other police officers, it really affected its marriage, their marriages. I mean, police officers have a really high divorce rate. It's somewhere around 75 to 80%, whereas if I'm not mistaken, the national average is somewhere around 53%. So what was happening back in the 80s and 90s, uh, 70s, as police officers would bring the job home, you had to have a very special kind of spouse who would deal with that. And one of the things I've found over the years that a police marriage tended to work better if they got married if they got married with the wife knowing what she was getting into. In other words, if the wife dated the police officer and then they got married afterwards, as opposed to what was very difficult for a lot of spouses was they were living what I call a normal life. The husband was working or the wife was working 9 to 5, and then all of a sudden they're working midnight shifts, they're working early night shifts. That was very difficult to deal with for a lot of people.
And then when you talk about the PTSD and traumatic event, we are all human beings, as I said, and then you and I are the same, even though our occupation is different. And then obviously the police officers have to see this crazy human side and then dead bodies and then all this craziness of human being that you just have to deal with it. And then it sounds like back then you just were told to deal with it.
Exactly. Deal with it. Um, uh, in my second book, Murder at the Front Door, the police officer w- would come home and try and talk to his wife, and his wife would just say, "Don't tell anyone at work this because you'll get fired." So he didn't have that outlet. So pressure, stress is cumulative. and it built up over the years and over the years, and finally, this one person he murdered, he blamed him for a lot of factors that occurred in his life, um, and it just came to a head.
And like you said, the divorce rate between the officers very high in amongst the officers, and then also the suicidal rate that could have been maybe addressed if there was
Yes.
understanding of mental health and effect to your brain of seeing these traumatic things. Like say veterans, they do. I feel like the war, going to the war, like you expected to see these kind of brutal murders and dead bodies and like significant injuries. But for the police officers, I, I'm really sorry and then shocked to see that the system of the emotional support and then, kind of a traumatic cleanse part of it was not implemented, that you had to go through that.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, what a lot of police officers, talk about right now is they get very frustrated at what some of them will refer to as the liberal media, and it seems sometimes that the media is going out of their way uh, to really demonize police officers. Mistakes are always made. We're human like everyone else. George Floyd, obviously. Um, but since the George Floyd incident, the press has just done a wonderful job of demonizing officers to the point where no one wants to become a police officer these days. Um, State police in New Hampshire are 70 troopers short. Okay, they can't find people. Uh, Hampton, New Hampshire, we're looking for 3 officers. Salem, New Hampshire, we're looking for 8 officers. Every police department I know of is looking for officers, and it's very difficult to hire officers these days. I have a friend whose son, last year, graduated from Westfield State with a criminology degree. He always wanted to be a police officer. He got a couple of offers for interviews to go through the process, and he decided by his senior year he didn't want to be a police officer anymore. Um, Again, for the most part, I'd say that 98% of police officers do a wonderful job. In the 2% that screw up, it gets a lot of press.
And then I remember like covering. I'm a journalist, by the way, and then remember covering the stories and then going to the protests. And how did these kind of incidents influence your normal life as a police officer, outside a police officer job? Like, how did it affect you?
Um, what I am seeing, especially with the young officers, one of the things I like to do is I like to walk around with the younger officers and involve myself in training. When I was in Salem, working full time, I was a sergeant for 20 plus years. I enjoyed that. And now, like I said, in Hampton, New Hampshire, I'm a part time officer. Um, but one of the things we do a lot of training, and one of the things what we refer to as shoot, don't shoot scenarios. Should you shoot this person? Should you not shoot them? And one of the things I'm finding that is very significant is a lot of police officers aren't shooting when they actually should be. And in the a lot of these scenarios, a lot of them are getting killed. Um, and I think it's in part due to the press, where there is a lot of negative press on police officers.
It is very unfortunate, like in a way that obviously not every police officers have those intentions against black people or against minority. And then
Mm,
I am minority and I've been treated by the police officers wonderfully and life changing and life saving officers. And then they are, forefront, like really saving people's lives. And then again, like press and this reaction to the traumatic incident. That's very tough when you get so much like majority systematic bias against your job.
Yeah, one of the things you hit the nail on the head there is you will see on the news, no, nightly national news, NBC, CBS, ABC, that all the bad things police officers do. And they have this luxury, the news, of picking and choosing. You never see a lot of, or very rarely do you see a lot of good things that cops do. And that's frustrating. And that's probably one of the reasons a lot of people don't want to be cops these days. Just the perception they have that, okay, we're hated.
So, John, before our live interview, you kind of mentioned about reverse discrimination. Would you mind to share our audience about it?
It's happened, I'm from New Hampshire, and New Hampshire has a very small, it's a state with a population that has a very small minority. So we don't see incidents of discrimination very often. I could certainly tell you, I've never seen any as a police officer by other police officers. Um, what happened with me is when I got out of college, once the first job I applied to was at Raytheon in North Andover, right outside of Boston. And my job got held up for about 2 to 3 weeks because of they had to write a number of um, letters to the EEOC stating why they're accepting me and not a person of color. I eventually got hired. The second incident was in 1977. I always wanted to be a Boston cop back then. So I took the civil service test in Massachusetts, and I finished in the top 1%. And I never got called for an interview. And that year in Boston, that was the year they hired 50 minority police officers. All of them were minorities. So that was a little frustrating, but you just put on your big boy pants, and I ended up getting a job in Salem about a year later. And that was a year before the Bakke decision, which was Bakke versus University of California Board of Regents. He was not accepted because a minority was picked in front of him. That went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and that's when the Supreme Court ruled that a organization could establish goals but not quotas. So that was a landmark reverse discrimination case.
And sorry, what year was that?
That was 77 or 78. Bakke, Bakke, versus University of California Board of Regents.
Wow. So just to let you know and our audience know, I am from Japan, and I came to America as an exchange student, and I don't know why, but my guidance counselor said it might be easy for you to take this class, and that was current event class, and it was significantly difficult. And then my job, I mean, the homework was to read Time magazine column, and then I had no idea. And I remember, I think they were talking about affirmative action and reverse discrimination, just like you mentioned, and I had no idea. But I remember this picture that was portrayed for the article, that a lot of people are climbing the ladders, and then a couple races are picked up or not. And then I had no idea why there was affirmative action, and then I had no idea why there was reverse discrimination. And because in Japan we only have Japanese people, we don't have black, white, Latino, all that. And to be honest with you, when you fill out query or job application, there's always race check. I've never seen that growing up in Japan because we only have
Wow.
one. Yeah, so it's very interesting to me to have this dynamic of, discrimination against the race and then affirmative action. And what do you take on that as
Well, it's interesting. You just made me think of something. A couple years ago, my daughter, for a gift, gave me the 23andMe genetic research you could do. So, it tells you, you're so, I'm, 87% Italian, um, 10%, 11% European, Mediterranean European, but I was also 2% African. So I wondered if over the years, my 2% African, if I could have claimed minority status.
wow. So being Caucasian and then have this reverse discrimination that you experienced, how did you feel back then?
It was frustrating, but I just deal with it. And like I said, you put on your big boy pants and you move on. You can't dwell on it. And um, I see it now every now and then. And again, it's frustrating, but you deal with it and you move on. I mean, I've always felt in the long run, the cream always rises to the top.
I like that phrase.
Yeah, you got to have a positive attitude in life. Very much so.
Absolutely. So we're gonna save those tools a little bit later. But I wanna actually go back to a police job and then seeing this um like traumatic situation where it could maybe cause you PTSD, some of the triggers that you may have caught like it may have caused. Can you recall some of the scene that you saw that sometimes triggers a nightmare or kind of comes up here and there?
Um, I have pretty good ego defense mechanisms. And, I've got some really close friends that if I have a problem, I talk with them, amongst them being my wife, being my best friend. Um, so I'm not too bad, but I've seen, just a lot of other officers. For instance, we had one officer who was involved in a shooting. It was, he and two other guys shot someone who was aiming a shotgun at another police officer. And it was a very good shoot, but he just went to pieces. He just went to pieces. And, we're talking about someone who's about 30 years old. And he ended up retiring on a medical. And this was about 15, 20 years ago. And he's still on medication and he still has a lot of nightmares. Um, there was another officer who was accidentally shot by an officer behind him. What happened was they were approaching the car on a felony stop. The guy was wanted for armed robbery, and the officer who did the shooting by accident had his finger on the trigger. He tripped and shot the other officer in the shoulder. Fortunately, it wasn't, he recovered 95%, 95%, but they both ended up retiring on a medical disability. And again, there are just some really bad accidents where you see someone's scalp peeled back and see parts of their skull. Uh, I've seen arms ripped off. And again, those are the nights go home or you have what's known as a quiet practice with a few buddies and have a few drinks and just talk it out. And some people deal with it better than others. I fortunately was able to deal with it pretty well.
Yeah, and it's just so heartbreaking that you become a police officer um, in a very good intention, and then obviously it's a high risk job, and not expecting these traumatic event that can break you to pieces, and then some commit suicide, and it's just very heartbreaking to see, especially good officers with a good intention had to go through that.
Yes. Yeah, and I when I'm out with the new kids walking the beat during the summer, um, here in Hampton, I try and let them know what they're gonna be in for, and it's usually sometimes it's a very rude awakening.
Well, thank you so much, John. I have a lot of respect for police officers, firefighters, the first responders that are absolutely risking their lives every day out there and really doing their job that not so many people want to do. And thank you for your service
Thank you.
for many years, and thank you for keeping our society safe.
Thank you.
Absolutely. So let's move on to our second question, which are the tools. You kind of mentioned a little bit about, quiet practice and then maybe drinking beers or sharing with your friends, but can you please break it down more? But before we ask your answers, I just want to mention, John, that this is one of my favorite part of the podcast because when I started this year, I've had no expectation. I just wanted to start a podcast to talk about not only about the diversities, but the tools that people can overcome quicker. Because in my case, for instance, child sex abuse, domestic violence, homelessness, bullying, like when you have a fever, you go to CVS and get Tylenol or ibuprofen to reduce the fever. But when you do have the PTSD, and then when you especially don't even know that you have PTSD, and then what it does to your brain and then to your emotional reaction to it. Like I struggled so much. I would say 30 years of my life not knowing what was going on and then what's wrong with me, and then blamed me and shamed myself and had so much low self-esteem until really recently that I started to figure out why there was no resources and lack of toolboxes that could have maybe helped me achieve more in my life. So I just wanted to share that with you. And then, being said so, this part of the podcast could potentially save somebody, potentially maybe bypass some of the struggles that we've experienced in 80s or 90s that people can use moving forward. So what would you say the best tools, especially as being a police officer, seeing these traumatic things that, you know, you can stay sane and then not bring the job home and move forward?
The best tools that we have now is again the wellness squad, and then possibly referrals to psychologists. Whereas in the 80s, 70s, 80s, 90s, you didn't have that. If you came out and said, "Hey, listen, this was really bothering me," or I don't know if I could deal with this, you were probably envisioned as being somewhat weak, whereas that is not the case now. I mean, it is literally 180 degrees. If a police officer goes to a tough call, traumatic situation, um, people automatically go and talk to him or her. And we're getting a lot more female police officers, which is wonderful. Um, but that was never the case. I think that is probably um, the best tool we have is one admitting that, yeah, this is tough and cops have to deal with it. And one of the ways we deal with it is by talking to other people and saying, other people realizing that, yeah, you're not weak by talking to us. You're actually strong by doing this and not holding it in and not taking it home with you. This is by far the best thing to do.
Well, thank you so much for saying that. And I'm very happy that Wellness Squad is available for the police officers now. And then even like recognizing even the beforehand something happens that they can prevent these mental health issues that can like lifelong last and then have significant impact. So I'm very glad to hear that. But do
I
you
mean, the other thing that's interesting is when I became a police officer, I had to go to the police academy. and that was only 6 weeks. Police academy now is 16 weeks, and it's going to 18 weeks, and they deal with that. How do you deal with the stress? Whereas before, no, you never saw that at a police academy. But you're seeing a lot of things at the academy that you would not see in the past, like implicit bias, de-escalation tactics, and it's taken a step in a nice direction.
That is incredible to hear. Why do you think the shift happened?
Um, I think it was the intelligent thing to do, and more and more people were realizing, okay, we have to do this. Police officers are human; they're not superhuman, and they deal with a lot of things that other people just would never see in life. Like, I've been to an accident where I've seen someone's arm rip off. I've been to a decapitation accident, and then you we see domestics all the time, and you got to deal with that.
So do you have really, but you really had a career without the wellness squad, without all this extra training at the academy, but you kind of dealt with it. But then like, how do you really not bring that home? And then you mentioned that you were bachelor for a while, and then maybe that helped to not bring it into the relationship. But then even not wife and husband situation, you have friends and you have families, and then like how do you not bring that into like when you clock out? Like, were you able to completely separate yourself and enjoy your life and then they just kind of leave it behind the door?
I was one of those people that I'm able to do that. A lot of other people weren't. Like I said, probably the only call that I really took home with me was when that baby died. But outside of that, I deal with it pretty well.
Would you say having your financial and economical background, like the knowledge that you have, helped you?
Very much so, especially economics, because economics to me is very logical. Usually if this, if A, then B, and quite possibly C. So, I mean, one of the things I've never had a problem with is finances, so that helps a lot too. Um, again, I was a bachelor for a long time, and during that bachelorhood, besides being a police officer, I was teaching part time, and I had a number of businesses. One of the businesses being I had a flight school and a charter business, so I did fairly well with that, and everything worked out well for me.
Well, that's incredible. So maybe not just being a police officer, but having a completely different job
Yeah,
needed to.
very much so. That was almost like an outlet sometimes. Like, all right, I need a break from police work, okay? And I'm gonna do this, and, like, I'll give you an example, there's been some particularly rough summers at Hampton Beach, particularly the summer of 2020, and right after the summer was over, I just took a one-month break from police work. Now, I may work an occasional detail, but I wasn't working any shifts. I just needed time to simmer down and decompress.
I don't think people understand the decompression part is
Yeah.
important.
I mean, one of the things you have to learn to deal with very much as a police officer is dealing with stress. Excuse me. And one of the ways I dealt with stress over the years and still do is I work out a lot, I run a lot, and that's a really good for me stress reliever. But people have to find a way that they deal with stress and what relieves that stress.
And then I appreciate you saying that because everybody has different tools to overcome challenges and stress. And more people talk about tools and then share their toolboxes. I believe that it can triage, cleanse all these difficulties in our lives. And people do not talk enough about the tools.
Yeah, for me, the two big tools were, again, having a couple beers with friends, talking about it, and then just working out a lot. One of the things we do when we go to hire a police officer. We have a written test and we have an oral test, what we call an oral board, and three police officers ask the candidate a number of questions. And one of the questions I like to ask is, how do you deal with stress? How do you deal with it? And like I said, no, people deal with it differently, but for me, working out really has really helped.
Yes, I remember like I had a surgery in July, but before that, I was doing karate a lot, and I went all the way to green belt, and I did a Spartan race. I did a 5K, and when I was growing up, when I was especially physically, sexually getting abused by my father, always playing piano or doing physical exercise kind of escaped that part of it. And still nowadays, like I have a high pressure job as an actress, single mom, and a journalist. Um, very high pressure, high expectation of yourself. That sometimes going to this exercise mode in your head, you can just forget about everything and just focus on what you have to get through to get stronger, or just run. I think that's very important, and then I think produces some chemicals in your brain that can make you like calmer or happier.
I agree, and it prepares you for police work. I remember reading um, one author, O.W. Wilson, said that police work is 7 hours and 59 minutes of boredom, followed by 1 minute of sheer terror. So, when that happens at the end of the shift, especially say you're working a 4 to midnight shift, now I usually go home, maybe have a beer if it's a quiet night, and then go right to bed. But now you're really worked up, something, and something always when you're working early nights, 4 to midnight, or 5 to 1, something always happens at the end of the night, and you just got to deal with that.
Well, John, thank you so much for sharing this very precious story. I've never really talked to a police officer about the inside job and the perspective. And you are my first guest who is a police officer. And I'm very honored to learn more about the job
Thank you.
itself. Yes, absolutely. And I admire you for not just pushing aside, but finding the strengths and then resilience and then still be able to help other people. That's very significant.
Thank you.
Well, let's move on to the last question that I have, which is a gift that came from the adversity. So, Joan, how would you describe a gift that came from these challenges and adversity?
If I had, if someone asked me, what do you do best in life? I think I would like to say being a dad. I mean, I had kids at the right time in my life, in my 40s, because I had patience in my 40s that I didn't have in my 20s and 30s. Um, and just got to spend a lot of time with my kids. And, I went through a divorce from their mom, but it was a very amicable divorce. Um, I had the differences with their mom, but the one thing that I always said she was very good at was being a mom, and I think she reciprocated with saying that me being a dad. So all the kids turned out really well, and probably just dealing with people. Um, it's funny. My wife right now says. You're yelling. I go, no, I'm not yelling. That's being Italian, okay? Italians, we're loud, we're passionate. That's just being Italian. I'm not yelling. But probably the best gift, being a dad dealing with people.
Great. Before you go, I want you to have this situation where maybe young police officer is listening to our podcast or will be listening to a podcast of what you know already if they were going through a difficult time dealing with this process or situations, and with your knowledge and experiences, what would you say your biggest advice is?
Don't keep it in. Talk to someone. No, just keep it simple. Talk to someone.
And I'm not a police officer by far, but I think in anybody's lives, talking to somebody that you can trust is probably one of the healthiest, biggest thing that you can do to yourself. And then I think people don't understand the magnitude of it, because when you have very complex situation, especially where a lot of people are involved in the situations were involved, you're trying to figure out what was wrong, what went wrong, and then what could have, you know, be prevented. And then you just sometimes can't do that alone. And
Yeah.
then by talking, like you said, um, you can objectify, you can analyze, and you can listen to yourself as well as, you get feedback. But then what you said about don't keep it in, I think is important, because a lot of people were taught to be white male, like toughen up, man, you're a man, you
Yeah.
shouldn't cry, you shouldn't whine. But we are all same human being, regardless of race or gender or age issues. That I think we are all allowed and then deserve to be listened and heard, and then not completely be perfect.
Mm, yeah. Like I said, stress is cumulative, and you got to get it out. You got to alleviate it.
Well, John, thank you so much again for your time tonight. And I truly, truly, sincerely appreciate you sharing your story, A Gift from Adversity podcast. And then it's been such a pleasure getting to know you.
Thank you. I loved it.
Well,
Thank
thank you. Thank you for our audience as well. And I am very grateful to have this platform. And we have more guests coming in coming month. And then we'll have more dialogue around the adversity tools and a gift. Thank you, and see you next time.
Thank you. Bye, Juri. It was a pleasure.